15 years after China joined the World Trade Organization, Beijing's hopes for recognition as a market economy are being challenged. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. When China joined the World Trade Organization in December of 2001, it agreed to let member states treat it as a non-market economy for 15 years. That allowed the United States, the European Union, and other WTO members to use prices from a third country as a benchmark to determine the true value of Chinese exports and impose heavy anti-dumping duties. That clause by the World Trade Organization expired on Sunday. 81 countries already acknowledge China as a market economy, but the United States, the European Union, and Japan are refusing to comply over concerns that cheap Chinese products could flood their markets. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Yang Zhao in Beijing. And Yang Zhao, explain for us what it means for China to be a market economy and why it is so important to Beijing.
Well, Anand, it's very important for China because in trade laws regarding anti-dumping and anti-subsidy measures, there are provisions for different treatment between exporting countries who are considered to have market economy status and those who are not. As you mentioned, for those non-market economy countries like China, WTO members use the surrogate countries to production costs as the benchmark in deciding if they're dumping. For example, in 2011, the European Union said Chinese companies were dumping soy protein because it chose the U.S. as a surrogate country, whose production costs were much higher. And this is the reality of international trade that China has had to face over the past 15 years. And this surrogate approach has been written into the Chinese WTO accession protocol. So China has been obliged to obey this rule, even it has made China vulnerable in anti-dumping cases. It's important for Chinese exports not to continue suffering from high anti-dumping tariffs.
Now, critics argue that China hasn't done enough to qualify for this designation. How is Beijing responding, and are there legal options being considered against the World Trade Organization?
Well, I can tell you that the protocol signed between China and WTO never said that China will automatically be entitled to market economy status after 15 years of being a WTO member. However, it says that the surrogate country approach will be removed automatically after China has spent 15 years in this organization. And that's what China is after now. But what makes China unhappy is that the U.S. and European Union are trying to keep the surrogate approach, which violates the WTO protocol, but refusing to recognize China as a market economy. The Chinese Commerce Ministry spokesperson Shen Danyang said that admitting China's market economy status is one issue and fulfilling the obligation is another. And for your second question, yes, China is stepping up to safeguard its legal rights. And on Monday, the country launched a dispute resolution case at the WTO against the U.S. and EU. And back to you, Anand.
Thank you. That's Yang Zhao reporting from Beijing. Joining us now from Beijing is Keiyu Jin. She's a professor at the London School of Economics. From Brussels, we're joined by Shada Islam. She's the Director of Europe and Geopolitics at Friends of Europe. Here with us in the studio is Yukon Huang. He is a senior fellow of the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. And from Strasbourg, we're joined by Daniel Dalton, who's a member of the European Parliament. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Keiyu Jin, let me start with you. We had a 15th anniversary just passed of China's accession to the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And at stake here, it would seem to be the market economy status that China thought it was getting, as well as something called the surrogate country approach, which the WTO uses. Firstly, let's take a listen to the Chinese response to the passing of this anniversary. This is the Chinese Ministry of Commerce spokesman Shen Danyang. Let's watch.
According to Article 15 of the Protocol on China's accession to the WTO, it's the obligation of WTO members to stop using the surrogate country approach against China's exports as scheduled. This is clear and out of question, and it has nothing to do with so-called market economy status.
So, Keiyu, my first question is, what exactly is the surrogate country approach that Mr. Shen refers to?
Well, in fact, when you examine these anti-dumping cases and to see whether, say, Chinese exports are actually priced at a cheaper price than what's domestically sold. They're using a surrogate country as a reference. So a refrigerator in China, its benchmark cost is, benchmark in some other country. That's actually not quite accurate because that's not the true cost in China. So in that case, there could be a lot of, dumping, accusations towards China. But economically speaking, this doesn't make too much sense.
And Kay, what do you make of the broader Chinese complaint that it hasn't been granted market economy status?
Well, I think that, first of all, the market economy status is, quite, it's a very vague term, and a lot of so-called market economy countries are having lots of government intervention. That's been very prevalent since the Great Recession, 2008, and we see that in terms of exchange rate interventions, etc. But also, I think that, in terms of when it comes down to really trade, these investigations on anti-dumping is also of a very dubious nature. It's hard to distinguish whether, say, there's an overproduction coming from emerging markets because of anti-dumping or because simply the world demand has gone down. So I would tend to say that there's a lot of, lack of clarity on what that means. So hence, this is where the debate comes into play.
Yukon, is this something of a setback for China? We've had this anniversary come. The expectation was that China would be granted market economy status. It wasn't automatic, as our reporter told us, but he also told us that China's big trading partners, like the United States, the European Union, Japan, want to continue with this surrogate country approach. So is it a setback in a sense?
Well, I think the Chinese authorities see this as an unfair position. Until recently, the policy position, both in the United States and the EU, was that at the end of this period of time, this condition would automatically lapse. That was basically the assumption. But legally, people have been looking at other aspects of the law and saying, well, maybe it doesn't have to lapse. So what is really driving that? What's driving that, of course, is the rise of protectionist sentiments. Trade flows are declining. There's employment concerns in the West. Wages are stagnant. There's some sensitive commodities, which are actually being used as examples. Steel production is the major one. Oil, for example, if you look at it, prices have collapsed. Are these exports of steel or oil cases of dumping, or are they cases of what I call the cycle? You produce too much sometimes, prices fall, then they rebound. So that's why I think this non-market status is not really particularly helpful or relevant. It's really a question of how do we deal with these kinds of business cycle, these price issues, which are politically sensitive, and what should be the framework for looking at it.
Okay, let's go to Shada Islam in Brussels. And Shada, 81 countries recognize China's market economy status. Why is it that the United States, the European Union, as well as Japan, why have they been so reluctant to do so as well?
Well, it's a bit of what's been said before. Trade has become such a toxic political issue, such an explosive political issue in the West at the moment and in Japan. Populist sentiment is rising, the anti-globalization feelings that China is actually, symbolizes globalization. Jobs are going away to China or other parts of Asia. So it's all very toxic. And what should be rather a cool-headed, serious, rational debate on granting market economy status to China has turned into this very poisonous political discussion. And at the moment, people are just being very emotional about it. So the legal argument has just fallen out. I find this very disappointing because, we should be celebrating 15 years of China's membership of the WTO, 15 years of opening up of China, liberalization, etc. And instead, we're sort of stuck in this rather unfortunate debate. And also, once again, anti-dumping is really such a 20th century concept. In this world of global supply chains and value chains, you don't really know, prices, how difficult it is to determine which country produces what and contributes what to the final price of a product. So all of this seems to me just too political, no rational, no sensible discussion going on at all.
And Daniel, looking at the legal side of this, if the United States, Japan, and the European Union refuse to stop using the surrogate country method, will they be in violation of the WTO rules?
Well, that's a concern, yeah. And I mean, from our point of view, it's very important that the EU and the UK both stay within its WTO commitments. And certainly from our perspective, bringing China into the WTO in 2001 was
a recognition from China that it would play by the Western global trading system. And I think it's very important from the EU, the US and Japan's point of view that we make sure that we stick to our commitments to the WTO, just as China also needs to and give us the data that it sometimes doesn't give on the domestic prices, because without full knowledge of what the domestic price is, sometimes it's difficult to actually judge what isn't.
So you would be in favor of granting market economy status to China?
Personally, I would, yes, but that's because I represent a constituency in the UK that has a trade surplus with China. We sell more to China than China sells to us. So it's in certainly my domestic interest to make sure that we have very smooth relations with China. And also in the global sense, as I said, China has agreed to play by the Western trading system and by the rules of the Western system. And that's very important. And we need to make sure China is fully engaged in the global trading system as it is at the moment.
Yukon, the WTO already has rules in place against dumping measures, anti-dumping rules against member states that allow companies to sell goods below market cost or below those in the home market. Should they not cover those concerns that are being expressed by the United States, by the EU and by Japan?
Well, I think economists and even some legal specialists who have looked at this issue, I think many have come to the conclusion that this market status, non-market status is not actually very helpful, because you're dealing with a very complex issue with a guideline which cannot be adequately interpreted or applied. But within the WTO guidelines, there are actually measures, including anti-dumping measures, which could cover some of the concerns that people have. So I think a far better approach would be to forget about this market status rule, let it lapse, let it go by, and use the existing rules and guidelines to actually look at the particular cases where there are price concerns or market concerns. And I think that would be far more productive. And I think over time there also needs to be a broader agreement about exactly what are the objectives, and how do you actually deal with these issues. And I think that kind of discussion needs to proceed.
But it's become politicized, hasn't it?
It's politicized so that people don't actually want to look at it anymore.
Yeah.
So you've taken these ideological kinds of positions, and you're not getting anywhere with this kind of position. These debates are stalemates on both sides.
Keiyu, how has China responded to this criticism that exports sold at lower prices threaten market conditions, threaten jobs? What is China saying about that?
Well, first of all, I think China is becoming much tougher on the stance in terms of anti-dumping and this recent disappointment. China's view is that, look, there are a lot of other countries that have similar experiences, and if China is going to have a retaliation, which it certainly might, against these other countries, it will hurt other economies as well. So I think in terms of China's position, it is getting tougher over time. Truth be told, it is true that manufacturing jobs in the U.S. has on the decline has a lot to do with China in the initial days when it started to export a lot into these industries. But frankly, these manufacturing jobs are moving into other countries like Vietnam and other countries, Bangladesh, etc. So I think those days are kind of over in terms of stealing manufacturing jobs. But I think the important thing is that China's going to stand tough on these issues going forward.
Shada, Europe has imposed a 20% tariff on Chinese steel shipments to Europe. They cite anti-dumping concerns in imposing that tariff. Is it the European Union position that these Chinese shipments to Europe are hurting Europe's steel sector?
Yeah, that is the overall concern, that steel jobs in the UK and elsewhere, they're being lost because of cheap imports from China. But I think, we're also moving into a very difficult and fraught period of transition. Our colleague from Beijing talked about jobs going to Vietnam, etc., Bangladesh. But, there's an overall issue of automation coming in as well. So we're going to see a lot of unemployment in the traditional manufacturing sectors in the West. And the Western powers, Europe and the US, are just not prepared for that. There's been no diversification, training, vocational training, finding new jobs for people. So I think, frankly, we're going towards a very fraught period in world trade, just because we're thinking very much in transactional terms. It's very mercantile, and the overall WTO system, the World Trade Organization system, is in trouble because people are just not playing by the rules, and I think it's going to be very, very difficult. So yes, I mean, Europeans are blaming China for job losses in the steel sector. It's been the same thing for other sectors as well. There's a joint group between the EU and China that's talking about the global oversupply issues. I hope we can find a way out of it because, you know, trade liberalization has been the motor for economic growth and it's slowing down. If we have more restrictions and less liberalization on the world scene, we're going to go into a very difficult economic period for the world, not just for China and Europe.
Daniel, the General Secretary of the European Trade Union Industrial, Luc Triangle, says that China should be treated as a special case. Let's take a listen to what he said.
China does not fulfill the criteria for getting access to the European markets. And if they get it, then we are speaking here about 330,000 steel workers today in Europe. Well, we cannot compete with unfair competition, with unfair imports. So all these 330,000 jobs are at stake if we don't take the right measures.
So, Daniel, is this debate about market economy status being politicized to essentially protect European jobs?
Well, I think it's certainly been over-dramatised quite a lot. I mean, the sort of key thing with market economy status is it doesn't stop the European Union imposing anti-dumping tariffs. They can still impose anti-dumping tariffs just within the WTO criteria. But there is a general problem, as has been explained before, that manufacturing sectors in Europe and in the West in general are under pressure. And particularly in the UK, we see that. And certainly even in the UK, there's real concern about Chinese steel coming into the market. So the market economy status is a bit of a proxy for a bigger discussion that's going on at the moment about whether trade liberalization between the West and China is a good thing or isn't a good thing.
Okay, we need to take a break right now. More of our conversation about China's market economy status right after this. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to The Heat. China joined the World Trade Organization 15 years ago with the belief it would be recognized this week as a market economy. Both the United States, the European Union, and Japan are refusing to comply. Let's get back to our panel right now. In Yukon, talking about the situation getting politicized, the president-elect, Donald Trump, here in the United States, has vowed to slap heavy import tariffs on Chinese goods. Is trade protectionism at work here, and why is it rearing its head again?
Well, it's a convenient excuse to deal with an issue, and it's not appropriate. It's not really appropriate. China's exchange rate has been moving up, both up and down, over the last 10 years. Most people who look at it very carefully agree that China's no longer manipulating the exchange rate. It's actually, if it is doing it, it's trying to prevent it from becoming too cheap rather than too strong, and so it's the opposite direction. I think the concern is jobs, as previous speakers have said. I think it's an interesting note, however, that employment in manufacturing in the United States has actually been increasing over the last 3 to 4 years in absolute numbers, whereas employment in manufacturing in China has actually been declining in the last 3 to 4 years. China is actually maturing. It's becoming like the United States. Its manufacturing sector's job increases have been actually declining, and it's moving to Vietnam, it's moving Bangladesh, it's moving India. It's growing in the services.
Right, the perception is that it's the other way around.
That's right. Yeah. And here's the basic point. Historically, manufacturing and agriculture, because of productivity increases, jobs decline steadily over time. Sometimes very quickly, sometimes more slowly, but inevitably. And the growth, as you become richer and richer, shows up in services. And the big debate is, has productivity increased jobs in services, as opposed to the fact that it's reduced jobs in manufacturing? Actually, most studies show that productivity increases or automation in services actually increase jobs. So the future is not so gloomy as people make, but you have these cycles, and these cycles can be extremely disruptive.
KU, from China's point of view, it has fulfilled WTO obligations this past 15 years. As Daniel pointed out at the beginning of the program, China agreed to play by Western rules. It has done so for the past 15 years. So what options does China have now? What's next?
Well, I think that, this is a question of negotiation and continued debate, and I think that China will change its tactic going forward. But one thing to remember is that China's economic structure is also changing at the same time. As was previously mentioned, China, on the other hand, is developing more services. Its services is still occupying a very low share of GDP, and manufacturing relatively is on the decline. So I think going forward, we have already seen that Chinese exports have climbed up the quality and skill ladder. So, in that sense, its comparative advantage in terms of just cheap labor is running out anyways. I think what we're seeing as this kind of unfair competition or anti-dumping and these complaints about the West is a reflection that China is just producing things cheaply, which in fact is a good thing for many countries on the recipient end. I want to emphasize one thing, which is grossly neglected in the discussions about trade with China, which is that Chinese imports into the US and Europe had hugely benefited consumers, and particularly poor households, because poor households consume a disproportionate amount of Chinese goods in imports. So that has actually kept inflation at bay. I find it fascinating that this benefit does not get brought up. And in fact, anti-dumping duties, things on, things like refrigerators, etc., and washing machines are actually going to hurt US and European consumers.
That's right. The United States imposed tariffs on washing machines just this past Friday. Shada, the former WTO chief Pascal Lamy has said that ultimately China will be granted market economy status, but that the WTO would have to change its anti-dumping rules. If we look at it that way, are all the countries in the European Union going to agree to that?
Yeah, Pascal Lamy has said that. He said it to me as well. I think he's right, because when he was head of the WTO, he did try to change the anti-dumping rules. As I said, they're really 20th century based, and some of the panelists have pointed out to some of the disconnects that exist. I think he's right. I think the European Union is trying to beef up its own anti-dumping measures inside among the 27, 28 countries. So I think, yes, the EU agrees and believes, but it's very difficult to get the 27-28 countries on board. I just wanted to add a couple of things. It's very important to remember that one of the issues that the EU has with China at the moment is access to markets, and that's especially in the services sector. There's also a belief here that investing in China is quite restricted for Europeans. So, this debate is not just about market economy status. It's actually about a wider issue of how easy is it to establish companies, to set up joint ventures, etc. in China. How easy is it to access the market of services? And I think these are the issues that China has to clarify. I'd like to say again, I wish that, the tempers that have risen on both sides, and I wish people would calm down and look at ways of getting out of this conundrum that they've created. It's self-created. China's market is huge and enormous and very important to the European Union. Germany's expansion and economic future really depends on how Chinese economy does, access to Chinese markets. We rely on China for a lot of our growth. It's an interdependent situation. So we can't really afford a trade war with China. And I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope people cool down and look at the bigger, wider picture of, collective growth.
Danielle, China is the largest trading partner with 120 WTO member states. It's made a significant contribution to trade and in the last 15 years. Do you think it's getting enough recognition for what it's done?
Well, I think it's a symbiotic relationship in the first place. China needs the West in trade terms, and the West needs China. And I think we need to look at it in those terms. We need to look at it in the terms of trade liberalization in general benefits everyone. And you've seen a huge sort of growth in GDP in China, and a huge move out of poverty for many hundreds of millions of people in China as a result of trade. And as was pointed out earlier, we've had lower prices for consumer goods in the West as a result of it. So I do think we need to maybe sell the merits of trade in general, and China certainly has played its part in that, I think, by agreeing to join the WTO back in 2001.
Yukon, is this a public relations problem here? As Daniel pointed out, one needs to sell the merits of trade.
I think that's a problem for politicians everywhere these days, with the employment, wage concerns. free trade, the so-called benefits of free trade, the benefits to consumers, as one of the speakers mentioned, if they've not been highlighted. So I think we have to go back to the drawing boards more and basically lay out what I call a message which resonates with the public about why it is still good to improve or increase the trade regime, why globalization in these processes is sensible. I might just mention that there are some vehicles for addressing some of the more heated concerns. There's a bilateral investment treaty negotiation with the U.S. There's a bilateral investment treaty negotiation with Europe. Some of these questions about access need to be addressed as a forum for it. The Chinese have actually proposed a free trade agreement for East Asia as a broad measure because of the TPP has passed away. And again, that's another framework for actually talking to the U.S. and China a little bit more about some of these anti-dumping, these prices, these trade concerns.
Keiyu, from China's role in the G20 to APEC, it's played a leading role in promoting free trade and economic integration. Now we see this debate on market economy status. Do you think that would change China's free trade policies?
No, I think in essence it will not. I think China is really one of the true champions and also one of the biggest benefactors of globalization. I think it will inherently continue. That said, as we have discussed earlier, the retaliation tactic might occur in the short term, but that won't change the overall long-term policy for trade integration, because let's also not forget, apart from trade integration, globalization also comprises of financial integration, which will be critical for China's next step in terms of future growth.
Daniel, what is the United Kingdom's approach to its trade relationship with China? Do you think the UK would recognize China as a market economy after it formally leaves the European Union?
Well, I think one of the big reasons for the leaving the European Union was to grow our trade outside of the EU. So China is obviously the key market for that. So it's going to be in the UK's interest very much to foster as smooth trade relations as possible with China. I think the market economy status issue has got very politicised, even in the UK, because we have issues with our steel manufacturing in the UK as well. But I think in general the UK approach would be probably to try and go beyond the EU in terms of the bilateral agreements and try and go straight to negotiating a free trade agreement with China, which is something I know China have been wanting to start negotiations with the EU for some time and have been sort of pushed back. So I think the UK will certainly be looking at better trade relations with China. With regards to market economy status, I think that possibly is a bit of a red herring. I think the UK will want to have as smooth relations as possible with China.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.